Babylon. So Babylon is the latest film by filmmaker Damien Chazelle, who has easily become one of the fast rising filmmakers of the past decade, having previously done films like Whiplash and La La Land and First Man. I find it quite mind-blowing actually that this filmmaker, who's already won an Oscar for Best Director, has done some great films already, and he's only 38 years old, and that's only 7 years older than myself. And I think given the achievement so far that Chazelle has had throughout his career, it's always like a big event now when a new Damien Chazelle film comes out. And this film looked intriguing because of the ensemble cast, and that the story appeared to have some kind of dark tone that would be a fictionalised version of how Hollywood was at that particular time during the 1920s, when it was going through a very transitional period. But I did also bear in mind that this was an original idea, and that Damien Chazelle was putting his own stamp on how film was going through that phase at that particular time, and he was creating his own characters and his own vision for it. So ultimately it wasn't going to be this historically accurate biopic, but more than anything it's the writer and director's vision of those events at that particular time. Set in 1920s Los Angeles, Babylon is a tale of outsized ambition and outrageous excess, which traces the rise and fall of multiple characters during a transitional period in early Hollywood. I've said it a few times already, and judging from that plot summary as well, the transitional period I'm referring to is the late 1920s, in which silent cinema transitions to sound cinema. And that was quite a turbulent time because it was affecting other people's careers and their whole lives, but there was also uncertainty around that particular time as well, because it was going way back to the origins of how moving pictures first came into being and how the sound of cinema would totally change that. And of course we know now, nearly 100 years later, that it has changed cinema and it has changed people's perceptions on how they watch films. But this is an account from the perspective of filmmaker Damien Chazelle and how it affected certain types of people during that phase. I think the ultimate idea of this story is that it shows how Hollywood really uses and exploits the talents that they bring in and basically chew them out when things do change or go wrong. And I really like Damien Chazelle's vision for this film because he focuses on the love of cinema. If there's any film that I think is comparable to Babylon, it is Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which coincidentally also starred two of the leading actors in this film. And for being a film within a film, Damien Chazelle shows us the process of what it is like being on set of a 1920s silent movie going into sound. And not just that, but the reality as well of the processes and the starring and the casting, and when actually on set, the arguments that can happen between crew members. And also music, and of course, if there's one thing that the vast majority of Damien Chazelle's films have in common so far, it's the fact that they involve music. Of course, La La Land does as a musical, Whiplash does for its famous depiction of jazz music, and this one does as well. Jazz music, and just music in general, is Damien Chazelle's auteurist style, because music was, and still is now, a vital part of cinema, and it's something that he clearly loves, and it was something that contributed massively to this film. So I think in terms of that and the overall perception of the transitional phase between going from silent to sound, it depicts a very raw, narcissistic and very self-indulgent depiction of the film industry. But despite the negative portrayal of the film industry, it was a spectacle from the word go. It was just set up immediately from that opening sequence with the cinematography and the choreography. It was done almost like it was in some kind of dream. It was just absolute chaos and a traditional 1920s party in Los Angeles. And as well as being a dreamlike situation, it was pretty creepy as well, because it was like they were part of some cult. In that regard, and also from the depictions of sex and drugs, it reminded me a lot of Paul Thomas Anderson's Boogie Nights. And it was a really crazy way to start a film, but I feel as though, particularly towards the last hour, it kind of dragged on a little bit too long, almost to a point where it got a bit too self-indulgent and it lost focus. Particularly in the last 45 minutes, it definitely does go down a very dark route that is almost completely different to the rest of the film. But the last final sequences of the film come back to remind us what the central core of the film is and what it's trying to be. And in terms of those horror moments and the use of drugs and sex, it certainly did not hold back. It was almost completely unfiltered, with a Wolf of Wall Street kind of feel to it, which also coincidentally starred Margot Robbie. And the pacing of the story was very, very intense. It was loud at times, that might be a little bit overwhelming for a lot of people. You almost couldn't breathe watching it because there was just one thing after another. And from an audience perspective, those 3 hours really flew by. And sometimes when you think about films that are over 3 hours, a lot lot of people turn around and go, oh god, it's 3 hours, I don't know how I'm going to last watching that. Although in all honesty, the last 45 minutes felt like 3 hours. And alongside the absolutely outrageous story, the way that it was shot was absolutely magnificent. I mean, the opening sequence, which I've already talked about, that really set the tone straight away for the kind of film that we were signing ourselves up for. But the production values were absolutely amazing, including the sets that were done. They really kind of gave us that realistic feeling of that being a real set, and the costumes were absolutely on point as well. That really made us feel that we were in the 1920s. And like I said, Damien Chazelle puts his own stamp on his version of how Hollywood went through that change and that difficult period in the 1920s leading into the 1930s. And he does base a few of his characters in this film on a few stars during that particular era. And leading the cast was Brad Pitt as Jack Conrad. Now I'm starting to feel these days that Brad Pitt is only getting better with age. And I'm not talking about looks, I'm talking about his performances and his acting, because I think people take him a lot more seriously now, because when he was younger, people just looked at him as this pretty boy star from Hollywood. But now he's starting to showcase more authenticity and more genuine emotion in his performances. He's starting to feel less like he's playing Brad Pitt, but more so playing the actual characters in the script. And Jack Conrad is almost a reflection of how people perceive Brad Pitt as a star. And there are times with Conrad where he is the central core of the humour within the film, but equally there are times when you actually genuinely feel sorry for him, being this veteran star who is going through a period when he is changing from silent films, which he's been known for a very long time, and now someone's telling him that his career is almost done, and he has to look to other avenues to try and keep it alive. So I can imagine Conrad is a character who speaks for a lot of actors during that phase. But Brad Pitt was absolutely fantastic in this role, and I really enjoyed his performance in it. And alongside Brad Pitt, we had Margot Robbie in the role of Nellie Leroy. And in this film, she really gave us this true definition of a Hollywood movie star at the time, because she was like this 1920s version of Marilyn Monroe, someone who's immensely attractive, who really came onto the scene and starred in a number of different films, but equally battled a lot of personal demons as well. And what I loved about Margot Robbie's performance as well was that because the film is about films, it involves her acting an act. So she is already playing Nellie Leroy, but Nellie Leroy has to play the character that she's played. So there's like levels almost in terms of acting, such as that moment when Nellie Leroy is acting and she's dancing on a table in front of loads of men at a bar, and the director asks her to do different tears, like one tear, sob her eyes out, to just stare and almost cry. And it takes a really good actress to try and pull that off by acting as a character who in herself is acting as another character. And that's why Margot Robbie was a really good choice for the character of Nellie Leroy, because her emotions were an absolute whirlwind from start to finish. Because you saw her on massive highs, from the drugs at least, to suddenly dropping down to massive lows. And even though I said that Brad Pitt's performance was a contributing factor to giving us that really kind of devastating effect and consequence of the change that Hollywood was going through, ultimately it was Margot Robbie and Nellie Leroy that really showcased that, and she was like a real victim of being exploited as a star and taken advantage of, and as someone who just didn't know where to turn. And Margot Robbie again was absolutely fantastic in this role. So overall, Babylon's an interesting one, because on one hand it was giving us a dark and bleak depiction of the transitional changes from silent to sound cinema, while equally it wasn't trying to be a biopic, but was particularly focusing on a director's own account and fictionalised story of those real life events that happened. And Damien Chazelle still knows how to put on a show and a spectacle for the audience, because the characters were very engaging, the pacing was very intense from start to finish. Even though it was a little bit ropey towards the last 45 minutes, it was still a very enjoyable film that was very well made, and the performances were absolutely top notch as well. So what did you think of Babylon? How do you think the film represented the 1920s Hollywood phase at that particular time? What did you think of the representation of the drugs and sex in this film? How realistic did you think it felt? Did you feel it was a bit too outrageous? And what did you think of just the production values and how it was made? Let me know in the comments below, and as always, if you did go on to enjoy this video, then please hit the like button and subscribe for more, and have a notification bell ticked so you're notified when I upload a new video. And I'll catch you in the next one. Take care, everybody.